I just wanted to read a line of that hymn we sang earlier. Sometimes we sing through hymns and don't always capture in our hearts and our minds what we're singing about, but I love this line because it connects so powerfully to the story that Bob just read about the raising of the son of the widow at Nain. The voice is stilled. No words express the pain that lingers on. Our prayer becomes a silent sigh. All mortal speech is gone. The Holy Spirit groans in us with intercession strong. When tears have ceased and silence breaks, the Spirit stirs a song. Our prayer becomes a silent sigh. When I was a boy, 12, 13 years old, my dad was a pastor. And on Sunday afternoons, or sometimes during the evening of a work week, he would forcefully invite me to join him on hospital visits, to visit the sick. I shadowed him in a sort of de facto residency experience as a young adolescent in his church. I remember so many times as a teenager, toward the end of a visit, the rising anxiety inside of me because I knew what was going to happen. He was going to look at me at the bedside of a person, and he was going to say, "Andy," because that's what he called me, "why don't you go ahead and pray?" I could not put language and words to that experience in those moments, but what I felt looking back now was a crisis of integrity. Because there were people I prayed for who I knew were not going to make it. But he forcefully invited me to pray for their healing anyway. I struggled with that as a kid, trying to make sense of theological complexion, existential anxiety. And it wasn't too many years later that I read a little book called Alphabet of Grace, and Frederick Buechner's words connected me to that experience as a kid. He said, "I have prayed for people I knew who were dying of cancer, and who went on with their dying, so that if there were healing things that happened this side of healing itself, they were things I could not be sure of, except for that little part inside of me that was healed just a little bit by praying the prayer." We come to today's story, and like last week's gospel, as a story of another outsider. After healing the centurion's servant in Capernaum, Jesus and his disciples took a nice little 25-mile stroll southwest to the village called Nain. And Luke, interestingly, places these stories back to back. In the widow from Nain, we meet this single mother who had first lost her husband. And now her heart is so torn apart by the loss of her only son that she can't speak. The sacred silence of unspeakable pain. I have to say, in living with this story all week, I had another crisis of integrity. Because what I really want is to look at this story and say, well, that's great. Jesus was on the scene, healing and performing miracles. But what about now? What about those prayers that we prayed by the side of the hospital bed? Prayers for cures, prayers for healing. And if there was any healing on this side of the ultimate healing itself, did it serve the person well? It is what theologians call a triangle of terror. God is all powerful. God is all good. Bad things happen. Evil exists. So this is one of those stories. And I name it because all of us beneath the surface, if we listen to the story, might be wondering some similar things about the text. So as we enter into this story, we enter into that prayer that becomes a silent sigh. Because we don't hear this single mom say a word. She doesn't ask Jesus to heal her son. She doesn't ask Jesus to do anything much. And notice that Jesus doesn't bother to pray here. There's no room and no time for pieties or niceties in this moment. Because the text says, when he saw the weeping widow, he had compassion for her and said, "Do not weep." How could Jesus tell a single mom whose only son is lying on the stretcher dead not to cry? Then he came forward, right in the middle of a funeral procession, no less. Touched the stretcher, the pallbearer stood still, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The young man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. In a word, Jesus cancels the funeral here. And what we wouldn't give for Jesus to cancel some funerals in our own lives. Here's the thing. The big death and all of the little deaths, all of the little losses we endure throughout life, we naturally ask, where is God in all of this? If Jesus has anything to say about it, well, God is right in the middle of it all. Being compassionate when we are on the dirt floor basement of our grieving hearts, when there are no words. Jesus is the human face of God's compassion. And not only is Jesus compassionate throughout the Gospels, if you look at the specificity of this story, Jesus is not so much compassionate toward the son he brings back to life. He's compassionate toward the weeping widow. Jesus is responding, the overflow of his heart, the outpouring of love from his heart about this widow, because she would have been socially and economically bankrupt in that day and time. Women largely needed the protection and provision of men to survive socially and economically. With her husband already gone, with her son now gone, she could have been totally destitute, having to rely solely on the care of the community. And so Jesus stands in a long line of Israel's prophets in the way he treated her. It was a way of marking the holiness of nations and of people by how they treated orphans and widows. The two most famous parables in the Bible are about compassion. In contrast to the insider religious professionals, the outsider Good Samaritan had compassion on the man beaten by thugs and left in the ditch to die. And while the prodigal son was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. Luke uses this word for compassion in two later stories. the Good Samaritan, and the prodigal son. And there are 3 New Testament stories of Jesus raising people from the dead: Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, Jairus' daughter, and now this little remembered story of the widow of Nain's son. This is the only place in the Gospels where this story is told. I find it interesting that Luke tells it. In the Gospel of John, before Jesus raises Lazarus, what does he do? Do you remember? It's famous for being the shortest verse in all the Bible. John 11:35, Jesus weeps. Jesus weeps. In other words, Jesus is a man who is moved by the suffering of others. And this was a big deal in the Roman culture of the time, when being moved by the pain of another was a sign of weakness. It was something less than the full definition, certainly, of masculinity in that day and time. It's a first century equivalent to the big flat lie that real men don't cry. Whatever. When Jesus sees the funeral procession for the widow of Nain's only son going out of the city, he has compassion for her. One thing to pay attention to, this story lets us know that indeed Jesus is the human face of God's compassion. And God is filled to overflowing with compassion for those who have died and for those who love them. God is indeed weeping with them. There's a Greek word used for compassion in today's story. And if I tried to pronounce it, I would mispronounce it, so I'll just spare you the Greek geekness of it all. But the word used for compassion in today's story is an intense inner emotion of sympathy that accompanies mercy. In that day and time, there would have been the deep seat of human emotion, being the guts, the liver, the kidneys, the inside organs. The metaphorical way of describing the human anguish and the human compassion that flows from the depths of our being towards someone who is suffering. And Jesus' actions reveal what is in the heart of God. And what is in the heart of God is compassion for people who are in suffering. It comes from that bottom basement of one's whole being to see the suffering of another person, and it doesn't stop with that emotion. If we pay attention to Jesus, it is followed by what? Well, it's followed by concrete actions. Behavior that brings balm and comfort to the one who is split in two by deep pain. People who know what it's like to lose the life of someone they love, or people who know the pain of the losses of their lives. You could name your own. What are the places in your life where there's been loss? What are the losses in your life? Some of them go by the name of illness, financial ruin, divorce, depression, addiction. There's this little book I've been reading in this early summer called Leaving Church. It's by Barbara Brown Taylor, a memoir of faith. And I want to read a little passage of it for you. She says, like every believer I know, my search for real life has led me through at least 3 distinct seasons of faith. Not once or twice, but over and over again. Jesus called them finding life, losing life, and finding life again, with the paradoxical promise that finders will be losers, while those who lose their lives for his sake will wind up finding them again. In Greek, the word is psyche, meaning not only life, but also the conscious self, the personality, the soul. You do not have to die in order to discover the truth of this teaching. The finding life, losing life, finding life again. You only need to lose track of who you are or who you thought you were supposed to be, so that you end up lying flat on the dirt floor basement of your heart. Do this, Jesus says, and you will live. Taylor writes, I do not believe that it can be done. The promise contains truth that can only be experienced. And even when it is, I do not know anyone who readily volunteers for loss again. Yet loss is how we come to surrender our lives, if not to God, then at least to the great beyond. And even those who profess no faith in anything but the sap that makes the green blade rise may still confess that losing really has helped them find their ways again. I don't know about you, but I feel like my losses have been fairly modest in compared to many. I've not lost a whole lot in my life. I'm a middle-class, educated white man. Broke a bone in my wrist one time. I've been married once before. I think most of my losses have come in different ways, related to faith mainly. Wondering what sort of God we're dealing with here. Wondering what it means to come into church on a Sunday morning at 10:30 for an hour and worship God. Wondering in some weeks if any of these words that we speak up here fall on open ears and hearts, including my own. I think today compassion from the guts is what we need most. We don't really need more words. We need actions. But I'll offer a few more words before I close. I watched a TED Talk this week. It was about compassion. Go figure. A woman named Joan Halifax is a Zen Buddhist priest and author. She brought up some very powerful points about what I've titled today, the cure of compassion. She said, now we know from neuroscience that compassion has some very extraordinary qualities. For example, a person who is cultivating compassion, when they are in the presence of suffering, they feel that suffering a lot more than many other people do. They feel it more than other people do. Another thing about compassion is that it really enhances what's called neural integration. It hooks up all parts of the brain, gets it all going. Another, which has been discovered by various researchers at Emory and at UC Davis and so on, is that compassion enhances our immune system. Most of us are shrinking in the face of psychosocial and physical poisons, of the toxins of our world. But compassion, the generativity of compassion, actually mobilizes our immunity. You know, if compassion is so good for us, I have a question. Why don't we train our children in compassion? If compassion is so good for us, why don't we train our healthcare providers in compassion so that they can do what they're supposed to do, which is really to help transform suffering? And if compassion is so good for us, God knows in this day and time, why don't we vote on compassion? Why don't we vote for people in our government based on compassion so that we can have a more caring world? Exactly. Jesus doesn't see anything wrong with that. Christ comes to show us what compassion looks like in concrete form. And God knows we need compassion like we need air and food and clothing and shelter. And sometimes compassion comes in just those forms, doesn't it? that torn place that your grief, your fear has opened up inside of you, if you pay attention to it, can be a holy place. Look around while you're there. Pay attention to what you feel. It may hurt you to stay there. It may hurt you to see what you need to see. But it's not the kind of hurt that leads to death. It is the kind that leads to life. In today's text, Jesus had a whole entourage of people, a big crowd with him. It was like a parade of life, set next to a parade or a procession of death, of the funeral of this young man. And I guess all I can say now is that in the middle of all of that compassion, if Jesus is the human face of God's compassion, and this is what we have to go on, even today's story in Luke's gospel, God's heart is the first of all of our hearts to break over the loss of life and the other losses of our lives. I think this is why the word compassion, coming from the guts of one's being, means that before you and me are gutted by grief, God is gutted by grief too. After all, God knows what it means to lose a son. That is why there is a cross in the heart of God. And just as Jesus raised up the son of the widow at Nain, God raised up Jesus from the cross because the life force of God is stronger than the force of death. And Jesus spends a surprising amount of time healing people in the Gospels, and it comes in all sorts of forms. The late great African-American theologian and civil rights leader Howard Thurman once said, "Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive, and then go do it." Because what the world needs is people who have come alive. Maybe what we need to come alive to or keep coming alive to, or maybe even those dead places inside of us that need resurrecting. To be alive to the pain and the need of others. If that's what we need, then it just might be what the world needs too. I'll end with a word that Ellen DeGeneres shares at the end of every one of her shows. Be kind to one another. And I'll add to that the wise words of the Jewish philosopher from Alexandria. Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a great battle. Amen.